I don't think we do the church any favors by tiptoeing around what happens in the temple, or by trying to pretend the temple is something that it isn't, trying to pretend that it doesn't have any connection to masonry, that's just completely fabricated, and that just doesn't hold up. I think you're much better off when you tell the truth.
And it's the idea of the temple and its connections to Freemasonry.
Okay. This wasn't a big focus of the CES letter that I recall. Jeremy made his arguments sort of in order of how much they bothered him, right? I mean, he started with the Book of Mormon. He went to the Book of Abraham, polygamy, the first vision. He focused a lot on the different accounts of the first vision. And then after that, it becomes a lot more scattered. I mean, after he goes through the big ones, he has a lot of little ones that he complains about. And my reference, my memory, and I could be wrong, is that he didn't really spend a lot of time on the temple ceremony. But I did reply to it, and I have spent a lot of time on my own looking at the temple ceremony and its connections to Freemasonry. The connections are real. I think it's disingenuous or dishonest to say otherwise. And that doesn't bother me in the least. It does bother a lot of other people, because a lot of people think revelation is a process that happens in a vacuum, that Joseph is minding his own business, and then all of a sudden an angel appears, or he has a vision, or something happens in his brain where this whole new mass of information is dumped on him, and then he passes that on to the church as revelation, and then people say, now, well, wait a minute, this is similar to Freemasonry. Joseph could have gotten this idea from Freemasonry, and it's, you go back to the Book of Mormon. This is similar to what a lot of people thought about Native Americans. So it can't be revelation, because it didn't happen in a vacuum, because it happened influenced by the time and place and world milieu that Joseph Smith lived in. And for me, and I think for most people, that's exactly how revelation happens. Something in my life that has meaning to me suddenly takes on some kind of new significance, because the Spirit speaks to my heart and to my mind and tells me something that relates to something that I already understand. It seems very clear to me, and again, this isn't definitive for anybody, and other people have different opinions on this, but it seems very clear to me that Joseph Smith became a Freemason, went through, Freemasonry was very, very prominent in the 19th century in frontier America. It was something that was very appealing to him. And as he went through Freemasonry, it provided a sort of revelation to him as to how to repurpose these ideas, these concepts, all of this in a way to teach the saints the covenants the Lord wanted them to make. And so I remember reading one article by a guy who was both a Freemason and an active Latter-day Saint, who said that Freemasonry was a tremendously effective teaching mechanism farmers, illiterate people. I'm not saying all farmers are illiterate people, but you know, the kinds of people in frontier America who weren't scholars, who weren't educated at all in many instances, and some of whom were illiterate, were all Freemasons and were reciting and recounting long bits of the ceremony that they had memorized or that they had learned. And this sort of solemn formal ceremony was a great way to educate people that didn't get education about anything in any other way. And I see this scenario as Joseph seeing that the Masonic vehicle was a great way to introduce the temple covenants, which do not have a parallel in Freemasonry. The actual covenants are nowhere to be found, and it's the actual covenants that matter, in my experience in the temple. The temple ceremony has gotten considerably less Masonic as time has gone on. I first went through the temple in 1987, and the temple ceremony was changed in 1990 drastically to remove penalties. It used to be that you would make covenants and you would never reveal the things that you had just learned, and if you did so, the language that was used when I went through the temple is, rather than reveal these things, I would rather my life be taken. And then you made motions that simulated gruesome ways for life to be taken. And in the days of Joseph Smith, the penalties were lifted directly from Masonry. And there were things, I mean, the language was things like, may my bowels gush out to be eaten by the birds of the field if I were to ever reveal this. Or may my throat be slit, or just really kinds of gruesome things that Latter-day Saints found very disturbing. I don't know that Latter-day Saints in 19th century America found it disturbing, because Freemasonry was more common, and that kind of violent imagery probably wasn't as unsettling as it was to a 20th century audience. And so the temple ceremony kept getting toned down to the point where these penalties have been removed from the ceremony altogether, which I think is a good thing. But there are other sort of minor elements. You used to go to the veil in the temple, and you'd have to embrace the veil worker in what they called the 5 points of fellowship, that there'd be 5 points of your body that would be touching each other. Well, that was lifted directly from Masonry. It doesn't have any relationship to the temple covenants. And in 1990, it was abandoned. And so as time goes on, the more Masonic elements of the ceremony have kind of fallen by the wayside. And the things that matter, that I think are truly the revelation, are what have sort of bubbled up to the surface. And each modification of the temple ceremony in my lifetime has been a marked improvement, has focused more on Jesus and more on the covenants that we make than the temple was in 1987. So if you're disturbed that Joseph Smith borrowed from Freemasonry to use that as the vehicle to instruct the saints with the greater light and knowledge they receive in the temple, I can understand why you would be disturbed. I think it's not disturbing, and I think it gives us a very valuable insight into how revelation works, that we should expect revelation to work in ways that use things in our own experience to teach us what God wants us to know.
Okay, thank you, Brother Bennett, for sharing that. And As an example, as I went through a little faith crisis of mine in 2017, and I was just reading all of this stuff, I was around 16, so I hadn't gone through the temple yet, and learn about the endowment probably more than I should have. And
I did the same thing at 18. You beat me by 2 years.
and I can't imagine, like you said, you went through the pre-1990 endowment, and I've heard people share their experiences, like John Deline, for example, and how it was maybe hard or shocking at first. And as you mentioned, I went through the temple in 2019. There was a recent change just before I went through. So yeah, it was a pretty toned down version. I noticed that many of the things that I heard about weren't present. But I remember that I also felt this, wait, what is this? Is this supposed to be sacred? At the time, I looking back, maybe I wasn't even aware of what went on in the temple. I thought that maybe they just had a devotional or something like that.
Right. No,
So
well, I was hoping. I remember I was reading the Abraham facsimiles, and there are several times in the second facsimile where it says, "This is not to be revealed to the world, but it will be had in the holy temple of God." And I thought, wow, we're going to learn all these secrets. We're going to learn where Kolob is. We're going to learn where the lost tribes of Israel are. We're going, and so I was expecting this really wild, mystical download of knowledge. And part of my reaction was, okay, this is really strange, but also, and this is it. This is it. This is all. These are the big secrets I'm going to learn, because I'm not really impressed, to be honest. There's not much here. I am grateful that the church is now much more open about what happens in the temple than it used to be. There are videos on the church website that will show you temple clothing. I was freaked out by the hats and the aprons, and now you can see that before you go. There's a video that describes what the endowment is. That it's a reenaction of the Garden of Eden and the fall of Adam and Eve, and and none of that was told to me before I went through. I mean, I even had sort of temple prep that didn't prepare me for anything. It didn't talk about anything. It just kind of said, you need to be righteous, and you need to prepare yourself spiritually, read your scriptures. I mean, it didn't tell you anything about what happened in the temple. And I don't know if I made you uncomfortable by talking about specific things that happened in the temple, but I'm of the mindset that there are a handful of certain specific things that we promise not to reveal, and I will not reveal them. I will keep that promise. I will keep that covenant. But everything else, I don't see any reason why we can't talk about it respectfully. I don't see any reason why we have to sort of tiptoe around what happens in the temple, because all that does is create negative experiences for people who go to the temple, suddenly discover it's not at all what they expected, feel uncomfortable. I had one family member, an extended family member, who before going through the temple didn't know anything about it, and went through the temple, and halfway through the ceremony said, "Nope, not going to do this," and got up and left. So I don't think we do the church any favors by tiptoeing around what happens in the temple, or by trying to pretend the temple is something that it isn't, trying to pretend that it doesn't have any connection to masonry, that's just completely fabricated, and that just doesn't hold up. I think you're much better off when you tell the truth.
yeah, I understand. And maybe I'll show that I'm young with this example. But recently a Marvel movie came out, the third Guardians of the Galaxy movie.
I haven't
And
seen it yet, so don't
no,
spoil it too much.
all
I
right,
want to see it.
I won't spoil it, but the director James Gunn said that, you know, you can spoil yourself for the movie and you'll still enjoy it.
Hmm,
And with Marvel movies, well, you gotta be the first one to watch the movie, or else you'll be spoiled and everything will be ruined.
right.
So I think that sometimes we can look at the temple that way,
Yeah, yeah.
and maybe it's not so much about the spoilers, because as you said, there's specific things that we make covenants to keep sacred, but otherwise, it's topics that we're very familiar with. So I think that as members, we think that if we spoil or if we even mention anything that has to do with the temple, then it's spoiled and it's no longer useful. So I think it might not be so much for the spoiler, but the experience and the covenants that do matter.
Right. Well, and it's really telling that the handbook of instructions now lists the covenants that you make in the temple. And I think that's a hugely positive step. You know, when I went through the temple, I'm not even sure if I knew I was making covenants. That's how ignorant I was. I mean, I'd read the God Makers, so I knew all the weird stuff about Satan and aprons and that kind of thing. But they never talked about the specific covenants. And I remember at the beginning of the ceremony, there was a line, and I think it's still in the line. It's like, if any of you do not want to enter into the covenants you're about to make, please back out now. And I remember thinking, well, this is a hell of a time to ask. You know, what, I'm supposed to stand up and embarrass myself in front of all of these people? And I don't even know what those covenants are going to be. I did not know specifically what covenants I was going to make in the temple until I was making them. And I think that's not good. I think people should be fully informed. And the church now agrees with me and has put all of the covenants into the handbook. People can read them ahead of time, can know exactly what they're getting themselves into. And even in the new temple ceremony, they say, these are the covenants you're going to make at the beginning. Instead of just saying, don't back out now if you don't want to make covenants that we're not going to tell you what they are, they say, these are the covenants they're going to make. And they explain the covenants, which they never did before. They say, okay, the law of the gospel, the law of sacrifice, here's what they mean. Because before it was just as explained in the Doctrine and Covenants, or as explained in the Pearl of Great Price. And there was no really sort of specific, this is what this covenant means. And so I think we're moving very much in the right direction on that.
Yes, and you know, just to wrap up, and well, I'll say this part in Spanish. Uh, Para los que gusten ver es la respuesta de Jim Bennett a la carta CS, le voy a dejar una liga. Como comentas en inglés, pero no está en español, pero probablemente pronto lo tendremos disponible. Pueden leerlo. Ahorita cubrimos solo 3 temas. Hay más, entonces si les interesa revisarlo, eso es lo que vamos a ver en el canal, pero dejaré una liga si quieren leer su respuesta. And switching back to English, as we conclude, something that I've noticed and I've learned about your take on the gospel from our interview and different interviews and your reply, it's the fact that you don't shy away from accepting when you don't agree with something or when you think that something is wrong. So in this case, I can imagine that maybe in my ward or mistake, if there's someone who actively says, I think that's wrong or something like that, it's the kind of member that you try to avoid, or you don't ask them many questions because you don't want them to answer those things. So, you know, I see that maybe from the conservative side of a church, you're maybe too critical, and maybe to the critical side, you make too many excuses maybe for things in the church. So sometimes people feel something is wrong, or sometimes they have a hard time reconciling their belief that the church is the Church of Jesus Christ, and that there are this many gray areas in which they might not agree. So how, in your experience, how can you keep your faith and your testimony while being open to disagree or come to terms with hard topics?
Boy, that is a great, great question. I think it's a question that needs to be asked by every member of the church to some degree. And I want to be able to answer it, giving it the gravity that it deserves, because I think this is one of the great challenges of our generation, your generation, because my generation, when I was your age, the kind of information about the church that so many people find troubling was not available to people of my generation. It was if you were a dumb kid like Jim Bennett who goes and looks for it, who goes to a library and checks out a critical book. But it wasn't information that was talked about in church. It wasn't information that showed up on your doorstep. The only way you found out some of it was that if you were a missionary and you were teaching somebody who was a member of a different church, their pastor would give them a pamphlet that would talk about things that were very problematic, and missionaries would just wave it away and say, that's just anti-Mormons, the Satan is trying to deceive you, et cetera, et cetera. And the missionary wouldn't even look at it very critically, because often the things that were talked about that were anti-Mormon were things that we've just discussed, and have recognized that are factually accurate. Things that were called anti-Mormon, now the church has admitted to in many of its essays. And so that becomes a problem for a lot of people. So what do you do? What do you say to people to do that? And what I say is, the reason I stay, the reason I'm still an active member of this church, a faithful, believing member of this church, is because this church has connected me directly to God. I have as much direct access to heaven as Russell M. Nelson does. So do you. So does everybody who is listening. So does everybody on the planet. But the wonderful thing about this church is that it puts you in direct contact with God. And when you make that kind of a contact and you see the way God can work through the flawed vessels who proclaim his gospel, how he can work through me. I want to have as much charity for the flawed leaders of the church, for José Smith and all of his flaws and everything else, as God has with my flaws. I think that's necessary in order to be able to stay. So what I would say is this church gives you the power, gives you the covenantal power to access the Lord, to speak to the Lord directly and connect to the Lord. And I am confident that the Lord's answer to those prayers will keep people in the church. It's like, if you're struggling, should I leave? What should I do? How do I do this? Take it to the Lord. And hopefully, through your experience in this church, you understand how to do that. You've read the Book of Mormon. You felt the Spirit. The Lord has sort of provided the Book of Mormon as what I call a divine access point to connect to him. If you read that, I have every confidence in the world that you will make the connection that you need to make. If you serve in the church, if you go to the temple, if you do all of those things, those are all opportunities to make that connection. And once you make that connection, the rest becomes fairly simple. My faith is not in the perfection of Russell M. Nelson, perfection of Joseph Smith. And when I discover things the church has done wrong, and the church has done a number of things wrong, just as anybody with agency does things wrong, it doesn't rattle my faith anymore. It doesn't even come close to rattling my faith. That's not where my faith is. My faith is in God. And God has made it very clear to me that this is where he has put me. This is the church where he wants me. This is where I can do the most good. And this is where I believe so many members of the church have been called of God to be. And we have a great charge and message to bring all of this to the world at large. And the thing I would tell leaders, you say, okay, the people in the ward that are asking the hard questions, you just don't want even talk to them. Or the thing that I would tell leaders is stop pretending we have a choice as to whether or not we will confront these difficult issues head on. It used to be that we had a choice. We could just sort of bury it, sweep it under the carpet, bury these things and just not talk about them and hope they go away. They don't go away. We live in an age where this information is readily available within seconds of anybody that gets online. And if we just shut it down, we just drive people out of the church. People come to you with questions and they say, you shouldn't be looking at that. You shouldn't be asking that question. How dare you have these doubts? What you're essentially saying is, then leave the church. I don't see how we build the kingdom by making the kingdom smaller, by making the church smaller, by driving out people who doubt, who have legitimate, thoughtful questions about things that are genuinely troubling in church history and doctrine. We have no choice but to confront them head on. And the good news is, it is absolutely possible to confront them head on and reconcile them with a strong and vibrant faith. That's been my experience. And that's where I think my reply has been the most valuable. It's not that the answers that I've given are so brilliant that they are the definitive answers until the end of time. It's that the answers I have given demonstrate a model of somebody who looked at all these issues, was troubled by all these issues, and was able to reconcile them with the testimony of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. I firmly believe that if a klutz like me can do that, anybody can do it. And so when I had my faith crisis, that's what kind of saved me. It wasn't that Gilbert W. Sharfs was the most intelligent, brilliant man in the world. It was, okay, he seems like a decent guy. He did this. Maybe I can do it too. Maybe I can confront these issues and still have faith. And I don't think we should be scared. A lot of people, they talk about, I don't want to go on John DeLynn because I'm scared of him. I'm scared that he's going to trap me. I'm scared. Well, first of all, I think John DeLynn is a good guy. I don't think he's trying to trap anybody. But I also think that fear needs to be replaced with faith. We can have every confidence that the Lord is with us, and we don't need to be afraid. And if somebody confronts us with something that we haven't heard before and that shakes us up, there is no dishonor in saying, ooh, I hadn't heard that before. That shakes me up a little bit. I need to go look at that. There's nothing wrong with that. We don't do the church any favors by shying away from hard things. And we don't need to be afraid of them. We can just go forward with faith. And so I guess that's the short summation of my very long answer.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think that in this community, in this maybe YouTube social media community that has come in the recent years with both critics and apologists, and I think that we're all learning precisely that, that the more afraid or the more angry we act with each other, the harder it is to come to terms with many of these topics. So thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your response and your story. And is there anything else that you'd like to say before we wrap up?
I just very much appreciate the opportunity. Very much appreciate that people who don't speak my language will get to hear from me. Very much enjoyed my time down in Mexico City recently with the Tabernáculo Choir. The audiences that came to those concerts were they just blew us away. They were just so alive. In Utah, we tend to be a little more conservative and a little more staid and reserved. And these guys were whooping and hollering and shouting and just in the best possible way, just out of pure joy. It was just pure joy to be with the Mexican people. And so I'm very grateful that I can have a conversation with, at least through you, have a conversation with many people from just a beautiful, magnificent country.